Princess Lyra stood at the edge of the burning starship and watched her world collapse around her, and the flames climbed higher, consuming everything she had ever known, and her two dragons, Ember and Frost, circled above their scales, reflecting the orange glow of destruction, and they cried out in distress, sensing their master's fear. And the Zarkanian fleet had found them at last, and their massive warships surrounded her damaged vessel like predators closing in on wounded prey. And there was nowhere left to run and nowhere left to hide. The elven princess pressed her hand against the cold metal wall, feeling the vibrations of explosions rippling through the hull, and her people were dying, and she could hear their screams echoing. Through the corridors and the escape pods had all launched, but she remained behind, trying to salvage the ancient data cores that contained the last hope for her civilization. And without these records, her people's history would be erased forever, and the Zarkanians would rewrite everything and claim the elven territories as their own, and no one would remember that her people had ever existed. Lyra's hands trembled as she worked at the storage vault, and sweat dripped down her face, mixing with the soot and ash that covered her skin, and her royal robes were torn and burned, and her silver hair was matted with blood from a wound on her forehead. But she ignored the pain and focused on the task, and the data cores were almost free, and just a few more seconds and she would have them, and then she could escape and find her people among the stars. Suddenly the ship lurched violently, throwing Lyra against the wall, and sparks showered down from above, and smoke filled her lungs, and she coughed, struggling to breathe through the toxic air. And alarms blared throughout the vessel, and the computer voice announced that hull breaches were detected on multiple decks, and life support was failing, and all personnel should evacuate immediately. But Lyra was the only one left, and there was no one to hear the warning. Except her Ember dove through the shattered viewport, landing beside her with Frost close behind, and the dragons were smaller than most of their kind, no bigger than large wolves. But their loyalty was absolute, and they had been with Lyra since they hatched from their eggs 10 years ago, and they were more than pets. They were her family and her companions and her protectors, and they nudged her urgently, trying to pull her toward safety, and their eyes were filled with worry. But Lyra refused to leave, and she clutched the data core container tightly, and these crystalline storage devices held 10,000 years of elven knowledge and science and culture and art and music and poetry and philosophy. And she would rather die than let them fall into enemy hands. And the Zarkanians would use this information to hunt down the remaining elven refugees scattered across the galaxy and destroy them, one by one, until nothing remained of her civilization. Then she heard footsteps and heavy boots clanging on metal, and Zarkanian soldiers were boarding the ship, and their harsh voices barked orders in their guttural language, and they were searching for survivors and for anything valuable they could steal, and they were getting closer. And Lyra knew she had minutes at best before they found her. And Ember growled low in his throat, and flames flickered between his teeth, and his red scales gleamed in the firelight, and Frost spread her wings defensively, and ice crystals formed in the air around her, and her blue scales shimmered with cold energy. The princess made her decision, and she activated the ship's self-destruct sequence and typed in her royal authorization code, and the computer voice began its cold countdown, and she had 5 minutes to reach an escape pod. But the nearest one was 3 decks down, and the corridors were filled with smoke and fire and enemy soldiers, and the odds of survival were almost zero, but she had to try. And her people needed these data cores, and they needed hope, and they needed to know that their history would survive even if they did not. She ran, and the dragons flew alongside her, and their presence gave her strength and courage, and they navigated through the twisting passages, and the ship groaned and shuddered around them, and metal screamed as bulkheads collapsed and fires raged out of control, and the heat was unbearable, and Lyra's lungs burned with every breath, but she pushed forward, driven by pure determination and the weight of her responsibility. Twice they encountered Zarkanian troops, and Ember unleashed torrents of fire that turned the soldiers into screaming torches, and Frost created walls of ice to block their pursuit, and the enemy's plasma weapons fired. But the ice absorbed the energy blasts and gave Lyra precious seconds to escape, and the countdown continued, and 4 minutes remained, and then 3, and time was running out fast. They reached a maintenance shaft, and Lyra climbed down the ladder with the data core container strapped to her back, and her muscles ached, and her hands were raw and bleeding, but she did not stop, and Ember and Frost followed. Her and their claws scraped against the metal, and below them she could see the glow of the escape pod bay. and hope surged in her chest, and maybe she would make it, and maybe she would survive. Then disaster struck and a massive explosion tore through the corridor ahead, and the shockwave hit Lyra like a physical blow, and the ladder broke free from the wall and she fell tumbling through smoke and debris, and her vision blurred and she screamed and reached out for something to grab. But there was nothing, and she crashed onto a lower deck and pain shot through her entire body, and she tasted blood in her mouth, and the data core container slipped from her grasp and slid across the floor toward a gaping hole in the hull. And beyond that hole was the vacuum of space and certain death. The princess scrambled forward, ignoring her injuries, and her ribs felt broken, and her left arm would not move properly. But she crawled across the deck, and her fingers stretched desperately, and she was inches away from the container when a boot stomped down on it and the sound echoed like a death sentence, and she looked up slowly, and her heart sank. Standing above her was a Zarkanian commander, and his armor was black and covered with the symbols of his rank, and his face was cruel and scarred, and his eyes gleamed with triumph. And he raised his plasma rifle, aiming directly at her heart, and his finger moved toward the trigger, and Lyra knew she was going to die. And she had failed. Her people had failed her mission, and the data cores would be lost forever. Ember and Frost screeched in fury, diving at the commander from above, and their claws extended, and flames and ice erupted from their mouths. But more soldiers appeared from the shadows, and energy nets shot out, capturing the dragons mid-flight, and the nets crackled with electricity, and they thrashed and roared, but the nets held firm and pulled them down to the deck, and the soldiers laughed and kicked them, and Lyra screamed in rage and despair. The commander laughed, and the sound was harsh and mocking, and he said something in his language, and then kicked the data core container and sent it sliding toward the hull breach, and it moved slowly across the tilted deck, and Lyra lunged forward one last desperate attempt, but rough hands grabbed her and pulled her back, and she watched helplessly as the container teetered on the edge, and everything her people were would be lost forever, and tears streamed down her face, and she had failed, and there was nothing left. Then something impossible happened, and a figure in a battered spacesuit came through the hull breach and moved with incredible speed, and the human grabbed the container just before it fell into space, and then turned to face the Zarkanian soldiers. And the princess saw the name Patch on the suit Lopez, and for a moment time seemed to freeze, and everyone stared in shock at this newcomer who had appeared from nowhere. Katie Lopez was a salvage operator who had been working on a nearby asteroid when she detected the distress signal, and she had no weapons and no backup and no reason to risk her life. But she had listened to the emergency broadcast and heard the elven princess pleading for help, and something in that voice had stirred something deep in her soul, and she could not ignore it, and she had fired up her small ship and jumped to these coordinates, knowing she was probably flying to her death. The Zarkanians recovered from their surprise and opened fire, and plasma bolts filled the air, and Katie dove behind debris, and the energy blasts scorched the metal where she had stood, and her suit alarms screamed warnings, and she clutched the data core container and looked at the captured dragons and the injured princess, and she knew the odds were impossible. But humans had a reputation throughout the galaxy for being absolutely crazy, and she decided to live up to that reputation. Katie had heard the stories about humans, and how they were feared and respected across the stars, and how they never abandoned anyone in need, and how they fought against impossible odds and won through sheer stubborn determination. And now she understood why those stories existed, and she felt something primal awaken inside her, and it was the same thing that had driven her ancestors to cross oceans and climb mountains and reach for the stars. She activated her suit's emergency thrusters and rocketed forward and slammed into the soldiers holding Lyra, and they scattered in surprise, and their weapons flew from their hands, and Katie grabbed the princess and pulled her toward the hull breach, and the Zarkanians fired again, and energy bolts struck Katie's suit and alarms blared, and she could feel the heat through the protective layers, and her oxygen gauge dropped rapidly, and she ignored all of it. The commander roared orders, and more troops poured into the chamber, and they surrounded the human and the princess, and there was no escape, and the self-destruct countdown reached 1 minute, and the ship would explode soon, and everyone would die. And the commander smiled because he thought he had won, and he thought the human would surrender. But Katie did something no sane being would attempt, and she threw the data core container through the hull breach toward her small salvage ship that was hovering outside, and she watched it tumble through space and prayed it would reach safety. And then she turned and sprinted toward the captured dragons, and the soldiers tried to stop her, but she was too fast and too determined. Katie ripped the energy nets apart with her bare hands, and the material burned through her gloves, and the pain was intense, and her skin blistered and smoked. But she did not stop, and she tore the nets to shreds, and Ember and Frost broke free, and they roared in triumph and immediately attacked the soldiers, and fire and ice filled the chamber, and the Zarkanians screamed and fled. The princess struggled to her feet, and Katie grabbed her arm, and the three of them, plus the dragons, ran toward the hull breach, and behind them, the commander was shouting and firing his weapon, and plasma bolts flew past their heads, and the countdown reached 30 seconds, and the ship shuddered violently, and explosions rippled through the decks. They reached the breach, and Katie pushed Lyra through first, and the princess tumbled into space, and Katie activated the emergency beacon on Lyra's suit so her salvage ship would retrieve her, and then Ember and Frost launched themselves through, and their wings spread wide, and they flew toward the ship, and Katie was about to follow when something hit her from behind. The commander had tackled her, and his weight drove her to the deck, and his hands closed around her throat, and he was incredibly strong, and Katie struggled but could not break free, and her vision started to blur, and she was losing consciousness, and the countdown reached 10 seconds and 9 and 8, and she was going to die here, but then Ember returned, and the dragon crashed through the breach like a meteor, and slammed into the commander and knocked him away, and the Zarkanian tumbled across the deck, and Ember grabbed Katie in his claws and launched back through the breach, and they shot into space, and behind them the ship exploded in a massive fireball. The shockwave hit them and sent them spinning, and Katie lost track of direction, and her suit was damaged and leaking air, and she could see stars and debris and flames all around her, and she thought this was the end, and at least she had saved the princess and the data cores, and that was something, and her life had meant something in the end. Then her salvage ship appeared beside them, and the airlock opened, and mechanical arms reached out and grabbed Katie and Ember and pulled them inside, and the door sealed, and oxygen flooded the chamber, and Katie ripped off her helmet and gasped for air, and her lungs burned, and her hands were blackened and ruined. But she was alive. Frost and Princess Lyra were already inside, and Lyra was crying, and she threw her arms around Katie and held her tight, and she was saying thank you over and over in her language, and Katie did not understand the words, but she understood the meaning, and she hugged the princess back and felt tears on her own cheeks. The ship's computer announced that Zarkanian fighters were approaching, and Katie stumbled to the cockpit and fell into the pilot's seat, and her injured hands screamed in protest as she gripped the controls, but she ignored the pain and fired up the engines, and the small ship accelerated away from the wreckage, and the enemy fighters pursued, and their weapons lit up space with deadly energy. Katie was a good pilot, and she had spent years navigating asteroid fields and avoiding pirates and outrunning corporate security. And she knew every trick in the book, and she pushed her ship to its limits and weaved through the debris field, and the fighters followed. But they were military vessels designed for open space combat, and they were not as agile, and Katie used that against them. She flew between burning chunks of the elven ship and through clouds of superheated gas, and twice she had to roll to avoid collisions, and the fighters tried to match her moves, but one of them clipped a piece of debris and exploded, and another got caught in a gas cloud, and its engines failed and it spun away, and only 3 remained. Katie checked her navigation computer and calculated a jump to hyperspace, but the coordinates were not ready, and she needed 30 more seconds, and the fighters were closing in, and their weapons charged, and she could see the glow of their plasma cannons, and they were about to fire, and she had no shields and no weapons and nowhere to hide. Then Lyra appeared beside her, and the princess placed her hand on the console and spoke words in ancient Elven, and the data cores in the cargo bay began to glow, and energy flowed from them into the ship. And suddenly the engines surged with power, and the ship accelerated faster than it was designed to go, and the fighters fell behind and could not catch up. The navigation computer beeped, and the hyperspace coordinates were ready, and Katie slammed her hand down on the jump control, and the universe stretched and twisted, and they vanished from normal space and entered the swirling colors of hyperspace, and they were safe. And the Zarkanians were left far behind. The sudden silence. Katie slumped in her seat, and exhaustion hit her like a wave, and her hands throbbed with pain, and her body ached, and she realized she was shaking, and the adrenaline was wearing off, and she started to laugh, and she did not know why, but she could not stop. Lyra knelt beside her and gently took Katie's ruined hands and whispered more words, and a soft green light glowed from her palms, and the pain faded, and Katie watched in amazement as her burned skin healed and new flesh grew. And within minutes her hands were whole again and she flexed her fingers and they worked perfectly. The princess smiled and said thank you in heavily accented English, and those were the only words she knew. And Katie smiled back and said, "You are welcome," and then asked, "Do you speak Galactic Common?" And Lyra nodded and switched to that language, and said, "You saved my life and my people and everything we are, and I can never repay this debt." Katie shrugged and said, "I just did what anyone would do." And Lyra laughed and shook her head and said, "No human you do not understand, and no one else in the galaxy would have done what you did. And the Zarkanians had been hunting us for months, and we sent distress calls to dozens of worlds and species and fleets, and no one came and no one helped. And everyone was too afraid of the Zarkanians, or too busy with their own problems, but you came and you had no reason to risk your life, and yet you did." The human looked uncomfortable and said, "Well, I heard your broadcast and you sounded desperate and I could not just ignore it, and besides, I was in the neighborhood anyway." And Lyra smiled because she knew Katie was lying. And the asteroid field where she had been working was 3 systems away, and she had jumped into a war zone to save a complete stranger. Ember and Frost approached and nuzzled against Katie, and their scales were warm and they purred like giant cats, and Katie laughed and scratched behind their ears and asked, "What are their names?" And Lyra said, "The red one is Ember and the blue one is Frost. And they are my oldest friends and they like you very much." And Katie said, "Well, I like them too," and she had never seen dragons before, and they were beautiful and terrifying at the same time. The princess stood and walked to the cargo bay and returned with the data core container, and she held it reverently and said, "This contains everything my people are and were and will be, and 10,000 years of history and knowledge and culture. And without it we would be truly lost. And the Zarkanians want to erase us from existence and claim our worlds and our resources, and now they cannot. And because you saved this," Katie looked at the glowing crystals and asked, "What will you do now and where will you go?" And Lyra sighed and said, "I must find my people," and they scattered across the galaxy when the Zarkanians attacked our homeworld, and some went to the outer colonies and some went to the trade stations and some went into hiding, and I need to gather them and find us a new home and rebuild our civilization." The human thought for a moment and said, "I know some places where you might be safe, and there are systems on the frontier that are unclaimed and uncharted, and the Zarkanians do not patrol there, and you could hide and rebuild." And Lyra looked at her with hope in her eyes and said, "You would help us more, and why?" And Katie said, "Because it's the right thing to do, and also because I think the galaxy is better with elves in it." They traveled through hyperspace for 3 days, and Katie set course for a remote sector she knew from her salvage work, and during the journey she and Lyra talked and learned about each other and their cultures and their lives. And Katie learned that the elven people had been spacefaring for millennia and had built a peaceful civilization based on art and knowledge and harmony with nature. Lyra learned that humans were relative newcomers to the galaxy and had only achieved faster than light travel 200 years ago, and they had spread quickly and established colonies and trading posts and become known as both fierce warriors and generous helpers, and other species did not know what to make of them, and humans were unpredictable and emotional and strangely kind. The princess asked why humans helped others so much, and Katie thought about it and said, "I think it's because we remember what it was like to be alone and struggling, and we almost destroyed ourselves several times before we reached the stars, and we learned that survival means helping each other, and now we apply that lesson to everyone." Lyra said that was a beautiful philosophy. And Katie laughed and said, "Well, not all humans follow it, and some are selfish and cruel and greedy, but most of us try to do the right thing. And we have a saying that goes, 'No one gets left behind,' and it comes from our military, but it has become part of our culture." On the 3rd day, they dropped out of hyperspace in a system with 7 planets, and 2 were in the habitable zone. And Katie had discovered the system years ago during a long-range salvage mission, and she had never reported it to any authorities, and it was her secret, and now she was sharing it with Lyra. And the princess was amazed and said, "This could be perfect." They scanned the 2nd planet, and it had breathable atmosphere and liquid water and forests and mountains and no intelligent life, and it was pristine and beautiful, and Lyra cried when she saw it and said, "It looks like our homeworld." And Katie said, "Then maybe It can be your new homeworld. They landed on the surface near a wide river, and the gravity was slightly lighter than standard, and the air was clean and sweet, and Ember and Frost launched into the sky and flew in circles and roared with joy, and they had been cooped up in the small ship for days, and now they were free. And Katie and Lyra stood on a hillside and watched the dragons play. The princess turned to Katie and said, "I must contact my people and tell them about this place and bring them here, but I do not know how long it will take, in weeks or maybe months, and will you stay and help us?" And Katie hesitated, because she had her own life and her own business, and she could not just abandon everything. But then she looked at Lyra and saw the hope in her eyes and the fear beneath it, and she thought about the data cores and the 10,000 years of history and culture, and she thought about how the Zarkanians wanted to destroy all of that, and she made her decision and said, "Yes, I will stay and help." And Lyra hugged her and whispered thank you. Over the following weeks they worked together to establish a base camp, and Katie used her ship to transport supplies and set up shelters and communication equipment, and Lyra used the data cores to access ancient elven technology and knowledge, and together they built something amazing. Other survivors began to arrive, and first came small groups in damaged ships, and then larger convoys, and families and children and elderly, and they all wept when they saw the new world and heard that they were safe, and Katie helped coordinate the arrivals and organize the settlement, and she became a familiar face and a trusted friend. The elves called her the Savior and the Guardian, and Katie was embarrassed by the titles. But Lyra said she had earned them, and the princess had become like a sister to Katie, and they spent hours talking and planning and laughing, and the bond between them grew stronger every day. One evening they sat by a fire and watched the twin moons rise, and Lyra said, "You know, when I sent that distress call, I did not expect anyone to answer, and I had given up hope, and I thought we were all going to die. But you came and you risked everything for us." And why? And Katie poked the fire with a stick and said, "Honestly, I do not know, and maybe it was fate or destiny, or maybe I was just in the right place at the right time." Lyra shook her head and said, "No, it was more than that, and you have a good heart, Katie Lopez, and humanity is lucky to have you." And Katie laughed and said, "I am just a salvage operator, and I pick through junk for a living, and I am nothing special." And the princess said, "You are wrong, and you are a hero, and heroes do not always know they are heroes." Months passed, and the settlement grew and became a town and then a small city, and the elves planted forests and built beautiful structures and created art and music, and slowly their civilization began to heal, and the data cores were housed in a great library, and scholars studied them and preserved the knowledge. Katie stayed and helped, and she became part of the community and learned the elven language and their customs and their history, and Ember and Frost adopted her as their second master and followed her everywhere, and she had never felt so at home anywhere in her life. But peace never lasts forever, and one day the sensors detected ships entering the system, and they were Zarkanian vessels, and somehow they had found the hidden colony, and panic spread through the settlement, and people began packing their belongings and preparing to flee again, and children cried and elders looked defeated, and Katie felt rage building inside her. Lyra stood before the council, and her face was grim, and she said, "We cannot run anymore, and we have nowhere else to go, and this is our home now, and we must defend it." And the council members argued and said they were not warriors, and they had no weapons and no military, and how could they fight the Zarkanians who had conquered dozens of worlds? Katie stepped forward and said, "I know someone who can help," and the council turned to look at her, and she said, "Humanity has fleets and alliances and treaties, and we protect those who cannot protect themselves, and I can call for help." And Lyra asked, "Will they come in time?" And Katie said, "I do not know, but I have to try." She sent out a distress signal on all human frequencies and included her identification codes and her location, and a full report of the situation, and she explained that an innocent civilization was about to be destroyed and that she was requesting immediate military assistance. And then she waited and prayed that someone would hear and someone would care. Hours passed, and the Zarkanian fleet moved closer, and their ships were massive and heavily armed, and they sent a transmission demanding immediate surrender and threatening complete destruction if the elves resisted, and Lyra replied with defiance and said they would never surrender, and the Zarkanians laughed and began preparing their attack. Katie worked with the elven engineers, and they built defensive shields around the settlement using technology from the data cores, and it was ancient but still functional, and they set up weapons emplacements and organized evacuation routes, and did everything they could to prepare, but everyone knew it was not enough. The attack began at dawn, and Zarkanian fighters screamed through the atmosphere and bombed the outer structures, and explosions rocked the settlement, and fires erupted, and the shields held but were weakening, and the main fleet moved into orbit and began positioning their heavy weapons, and it was only a matter of time. Katie piloted her salvage ship into the air, and Ember and Frost flew beside her, and together they attacked the fighters, and her ship was small and fast, and the dragons breathed fire and ice, and they destroyed 3 fighters before the others realized what was happening and began coordinating their attacks. The odds were impossible, and Katie was one ship against dozens, and the dragons were brave but vulnerable, and plasma bolts scorched the air around them, and Katie dodged and weaved and fired her mining lasers, which were not designed for combat but still did damage, and she thought about all the people below who were counting on her, and she refused to give up. Then something miraculous happened, and the sky lit up with new arrivals, and massive human warships dropped out of hyperspace, and they were beautiful and terrible, and Katie recognized the configurations, and they were from the human defense fleet, and the cavalry had arrived, and she laughed with relief and joy. The human fleet immediately engaged the Zarkanians, and the space battle was intense and violent, and the sky above the planet flashed with weapons fire and explosions, and the Zarkanian commander tried to retreat, but the humans had surrounded them and cut off their escape, and the battle lasted for 2 hours, and when it ended, every Zarkanian ship was destroyed or captured. A transport landed near the settlement, and the hatch opened, and out stepped Admiral Helen Brooks, and her uniform was crisp and decorated with medals. And she looked at Katie and smiled and said, "Katie Lopez, I should have known you would be in the middle of something like this," and Katie grinned and said, "It's good to see you, Admiral." Helen had been Katie's commanding officer years ago when Katie had served in the fleet, and they had remained friends after Katie left to become a salvage operator. And Helen said, "When I received your distress call, I was 3 systems away, and I brought everything I had." And Katie said, "You came just in time, and thank you." And Helen said, "We look after our own, and anyone you are protecting is under our protection too." Princess Lyra approached and bowed formally and said, "On behalf of my people, I thank you for your help, and you have saved us." And Helen bowed back and said, "Princess Lyra, it is an honor, and humanity does not tolerate bullies. And the Zarkanians have been causing problems in this sector for too long, and this was a good opportunity to send them a message." Over the following days, human engineers helped repair the damage and reinforce the shields and installed proper defense systems, and the fleet remained in orbit as a deterrent, and word spread quickly through the galaxy about what had happened and how humans had defended an elven colony against a Zarkanian attack. Diplomatic channels opened, and the Galactic Council took notice, and debates raged about the Zarkanian aggression, and their violations of territorial rights, and sanctions were proposed, and alliances shifted, and for the first time in months the elves felt safe and secure. Katie stood on the hillside with Lyra and Helen and watched the settlement below, and the sun was setting and painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. And Helen said, "You did good work here, Katie, and you saved these people and gave them hope." And Katie shrugged and said, "I just did what felt right." Helen looked at Lyra and said, "Princess, your people are welcome to join the human allied systems, and we offer protection and trade and friendship, and there are no strings attached and no demands, and we simply believe that civilizations should help each other." And Lyra looked stunned and said, "You would do this for us?" And Helen nodded and said, "Yes, we would." The princess turned to Katie and said, "You told me that humans do not leave anyone behind, and now I understand what that means. And it is not just words, it is who you are." And Katie smiled and said, "We try our best, and sometimes we fail, but we never stop trying." Weeks passed, and more human ships arrived and brought supplies, and technology and experts, and the settlement transformed into a thriving colony, and trade routes were established, and elven goods began flowing into human markets, and their art and music became popular, and people across the galaxy wanted to learn about this ancient civilization that had survived extinction. Katie received offers to join the fleet again, and to become an ambassador, and to write her story for publication. But she declined all of them and said she was happy where she was, and She had found something here that she had been searching for her whole life, and a sense of purpose and belonging. Lyra was crowned queen of the new elven kingdom, and it was a small kingdom, but it was growing, and the coronation ceremony was beautiful and filled with ancient traditions, and human delegates attended, and it was a symbol of the new alliance. And Katie stood beside the throne as the queen's personal guard and friend, and Ember and Frost wore ceremonial collars and looked magnificent. During the celebration, Helen pulled Katie aside and said, "You know your story has become famous, and humans across the galaxy are talking about the salvage operator who saved a princess and her dragons, and you are a legend now." And Katie groaned and said, "I did not want to be famous, and I just wanted to help," and Helen laughed and said, "Too late for that." The Admiral said something else too, and she said, "Katie, what you did here changed things, and you showed the galaxy what humanity is capable of, and not our military strength or our technology, but our compassion and our willingness to help. And that is more powerful than any weapon." And Katie felt tears in her eyes and said, "I hope so, and I really hope so." That night, Katie sat with Lyra on the palace balcony, and they drank elven wine and watched the stars, and Lyra said, "Do you ever regret it in giving up your old life to stay here?" And Katie thought about it and said, "No, never, and this is where I belong, and you are my family now." The queen smiled and said, "And you are mine, and you will always have a home here. And your children and your children's children will be welcome in our halls, and we will never forget what you did. And your name will be remembered in our songs and stories for 10,000 years. Katie laughed and said, "That is a long time," and Lyra said, "It is not long enough." And they sat in comfortable silence, and Ember and Frost slept nearby, and the twin moons rose and cast silver light across the land, and everything was peaceful and perfect. Years passed, and the new elven kingdom flourished and grew and became a beacon of culture and knowledge in the galaxy. And the data cores were studied, and new discoveries were made, and ancient elven technology was combined with human innovation, and created wonders, and the alliance between the two species became stronger and deeper. Katie remained as the queen's closest advisor and friend, and she helped negotiate treaties and establish trade agreements and train the new elven defense force, because everyone agreed they needed to be able to protect themselves. And she was no longer just a salvage operator, and she had become something more, and something important. Ember and Frost grew larger and more powerful, and they became the symbol of the kingdom and appeared on flags and monuments, and children drew pictures of them and told stories about the brave dragons who helped save their people. And the dragons seemed to understand their importance and carried themselves with dignity and grace. One day, a young elven scholar named Claire approached Katie with an excited expression, and she said, "I have been studying the ancient records, and I found something amazing." And Katie asked, "What did you find?" And Claire said references to other lost colonies and elven settlements that escaped the Zarkanian invasion, and they might still be out there, and we could find them and bring them home. Katie brought this information to Queen Lyra and the council, and they debated what to do. And some said they should focus on building what they had and not risk their security. And others said they had a duty to find their lost brothers and sisters and bring them into the fold. And eventually Lyra made the decision and said, "We will search for them, and no one will be left behind." A fleet of ships was assembled, and Katie volunteered to lead the expedition. And Lyra said, "Are you sure, and this could be dangerous?" And Katie smiled and said, "When has that ever stopped me? And besides, I know what it's like to be lost and alone, and if there are elves out there who need help, I want to find them." The expedition launched with 6 ships and a crew of humans and elves working together, and they followed the clues from the ancient data cores and jumped from system to system and searched planets and stations and asked questions and gathered information. And slowly they pieced together a trail. They found the first lost colony on a frozen moon orbiting a gas giant, and the elves, there had been isolated for decades and had nearly given up hope. And when they saw the ships arriving and learned that their civilization had survived and rebuilt, they wept with joy, and Katie helped coordinate the evacuation and transport them to the new homeworld. The second colony was harder to find, and it was hidden in an asteroid field, and the elves had gone into deep underground shelters and sealed themselves away, and it took weeks to locate them and convince them it was safe to come out, and when they finally emerged, they were thin and pale but alive and grateful. News of the expedition spread and other species began contacting them with information and rumors and sightings, and the galaxy was vast and full of secrets, and Katie realized this mission could take years, and she sent a message to Lyra asking for permission to continue, and the Queen replied immediately and said, "Find them all and bring them home, and take as long as you need." They found colonies in the most unlikely places and on a desert planet where elves had adapted to the harsh conditions, and in the lower levels of a massive space station where they had been hiding in plain sight and working as laborers and merchants, and on a paradise world where they had built a peaceful farming community and did not know the war had ended. Each time they found survivors, Katie felt a profound sense of satisfaction and purpose, and these people had been lost and forgotten, and now they were being brought back into the light and given a chance to rebuild their lives and reconnect with their culture. And she understood why humans had a reputation for never giving up. The expedition lasted 3 years, and they found 27 lost colonies and settlements, and thousands of elves who had thought they were alone in the universe, and the population of the new elven kingdom tripled, and the cities expanded, and new towns were founded, and the culture became richer and more diverse. When Katie finally returned home, she was greeted as a hero and people lined the streets and cheered, and children threw flowers. And Lyra stood at the spaceport and embraced her and said, "Welcome home, sister, and you have done something incredible, and our people are whole again because of you." That evening there was a grand celebration, and the palace was filled with music and laughter, and representatives from dozens of worlds attended, and Katie wore formal clothes which felt strange after years in her ship, and she mingled with diplomats and scholars and felt out of place. But Happy Admiral Helen Brooks was there, and she had been promoted to fleet commander, and she pulled Katie aside and said, "I have a proposition for you in the Human Defense Fleet. Wants to create a new division and focused on rescue and recovery operations and finding lost people and helping refugees. And we want you to lead it." Katie was surprised and said, "Me, and why me?" And Helen smiled and said, "Because you have proven you are the best at this, and you find people who are lost and you bring them home and you give them hope. And that is exactly what we need." And Katie said, "I need to think about it." And Helen said, "Take your time." Later, Katie stood on the palace balcony with Lyra and Ember and Frost and told her about the offer and asked what she should do. And Lyra was quiet for a long moment and then said, "You should accept." And Katie looked shocked and said, "But I thought you would want me to stay." And Lyra smiled sadly and said, "I do want you to stay, and you are my best friend and my sister, but there are others out there who need you and who need what you can give them." The Queen continued and said, "You saved me, and you saved my people, and now you should save others, and that is your purpose and your destiny, and I will miss you terribly. But I will be proud of you." And Katie felt tears running down her face and said, "I will come back and visit, and I promise." And Lyra hugged her and said, "I know you." Will Katie accepted the position and spent months organizing the new division and recruiting personnel and acquiring ships and equipment, and she called it the Pathfinder Corps, and their mission was simple, and find the lost and bring them home. And word spread quickly, and soon they were receiving requests from across the galaxy. The first official mission was to rescue a group of human colonists whose ship had crashed on an uncharted world, and they had been stranded for 2 years, and the Pathfinder Corps found them in 4 days and brought them home, and the families wept and thanked Katie and her crew, and the media covered the story extensively. More missions followed, and they rescued refugees from war zones and found missing exploration teams and evacuated colonies from natural disasters, and helped relocate species whose homeworlds had become uninhabitable, and every mission reinforced why this work was important. Years passed, and Katie became known throughout the galaxy as the Pathfinder and the woman who never gave up and who always found a way, and her reputation grew and inspired others, and more species joined the Corps, and it became a truly galactic organization and a symbol of hope and cooperation. She returned to the new elven kingdom often, and each time she was welcomed with joy and celebration, and Lyra had married and had children, and the kingdom was prosperous and peaceful, and Ember and Frost were now ancient and wise, and still remembered Katie, and nuzzled her like she had never left. One evening Katie and Lyra sat in the same place they had sat years ago and watched the stars, and Lyra said, "Do you remember when we first met? and you saved me from that burning ship." And Katie laughed and said, "How could I forget? And you were terrified and brave and determined, and I knew I had to help you." Lyra said, "I never imagined that day would lead to all of this, and to our friendship and our alliance, and to you saving thousands of lives and changing the galaxy." And Katie said, "I was just a salvage operator who heard a distress call, and I did what anyone would do." The Queen shook her head and said, "No, Katie. And you did what a hero would do, and what a true friend would do. And you showed the galaxy what humanity is, and you proved that kindness and compassion are not weakness but strength. And I am honored to know you." Katie smiled and looked up at the stars and thought about all the people she had helped and all the lives she had touched, and she thought about that day when she had heard a desperate voice calling for help and decided to answer. And she realized that single decision had changed everything. And she knew that somewhere out there, someone else was calling for help, and tomorrow she would go and find them and bring them home, because that was what she did. And that was who she was, and the galaxy was full of lost people who needed a pathfinder to light their way.